I think the pandemic really did, show this to us. And we knew there were benefits before, but it became really clear during the pandemic that there are benefits for teens interacting online.
Welcome, Jackie. Thank you so much for joining us for an episode of Parenting Understood. I would love to hear just a little bit about who you are and how you got into this research.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So, yeah, my name is Jackie Nisi. I am an assistant professor at Brown University, and I study how social media use impacts teens and preteens, development, and mental health. And I really got into this field of research because I've always loved working with teenagers. I feel like it's it's a challenging but really fun and exciting age. There's just so much change happening, so much development, and so I love that age period. And then when I was younger, so when I was in college actually, and thinking about applying to grad school, I was working for this company leading outdoor adventure trips for high school students. So we would go out and we'd be camping for weeks at a time. And as part of that program, we would take away students' devices when they first got there, and they would have no access to any of their technology for the duration of the trip. And of course, that was a long time ago now. That was maybe longer ago than I want to admit, but even then, it was really clear that when you took away students' devices, the whole dynamic of the trip would change. And it just became really clear to me that that social media and phones were having such an impact on teens' development that I decided this was something I wanted to study. And then this is what I pursued.
That's so interesting to me. And as the mom of a teen, and we just got back from spring break where we saw Michelle in person in LA. So that was very exciting. But we made our daughter put her phone away for a couple hours during the day. And it was really hard for her at first. And then I think she kind of liked it, to be honest, to have a little bit of that space.
Yeah.
But I just thought it was so interesting sort of watching that sort of transition from like, oh, I can't live without it, to, okay, maybe it's a good thing not to have it all the time.
Yeah, it's hard for everybody. It's hard for teens. It's hard for adults to put our phones away. There's such a pull, and so sometimes having that external force of parents telling them that they need to put it away for a while can actually be helpful for kind of prompting that a little bit.
I agree. I mean, and in thinking just of all the work that you've done on this, what have you found either to be sort of the most robust association between, sort of different aspects of social media and children's development? Is it time that they're on it? Is it the specific way that they're using it that seems to have the biggest influence on later outcomes or current outcomes for that matter?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I think, we hear so much about screen time. We hear a lot about the time that kids are spending, but I think the research, at least right now, would suggest that there isn't a super robust association between the amount of time that kids are spending on social media and outcomes. I think where we really see the effects are maybe across three different kind of areas. So there's what kids are actually doing on social media. And we know that there's a lot of different things they can do, both good and bad. And those play a really important role. It depends on who the kids are. So sort of what kinds of vulnerabilities they might come in with, or strengths that they might come in with that might impact how they're using it, and then how it affects them. And then the other piece is just thinking about what social media is replacing. So the time that they are spending on there, what could they be doing instead? And is it getting in the way of things that we know are important, like sleep or time with family, in-person time with friends, and that kind of thing?
It's interesting. You also sort of touched on this, but I definitely am very concerned at personal level about sort of screen usage and outcomes. But do you find any benefits to it? Because I know that kind of just comes from my own experience during the pandemic with a teen, and I do think she did get something from feeling connected, even though we weren't physically, present with folks. And I'm just curious, has there been anything showing in your work or, others that it might not be all bad?
Definitely. I think the pandemic really did, show this to us. And we knew there were benefits before, but it became really clear during the pandemic that there are benefits for teens interacting online. So I think, social connection is probably the biggest piece, especially with the pandemic limiting in-person social interactions. The majority of teens say that when they spend time on social media, it helps their relationships with their friends. So that's a big piece of it. There's also, opportunities for identity exploration. So kind of figuring out who kids are. And that's such an important part of being a teenager. Opportunities for self-expression, similarly. So there certainly are some benefits.
So this is projecting way into the future, but, thinking as a mom, do you feel like what you're starting to find in your research on social media and child outcomes, will that sort of mold how you introduce or don't introduce social media, do you think, to your child?
Yeah. So I have an 8-month-old, and so he's a little bit young for social media at the moment. But it's hard to say, because I do think that social media and the tech landscape generally is going to change pretty significantly. It already has in just the past couple of years, and I think it'll continue to do so. So it's hard to say, exactly what I will do in the future. But I do think that actually, that social media and my work on social media has informed my parenting, in that I'm much more aware of what I'm doing on social media. So, I pay a lot of attention, and I think this is because of my research, to, how I'm using it, what times of day I'm using it, whether I feel like it's getting in the way of my interactions with my child, or if I feel like in some ways it's helping, where I'm getting, advice or support from other parents online. So I think there are pros and cons for parents as well. And I think I'm more aware of that because of what I do.
Totally. I feel like the same way, right?
And same here. I think for me, I still have young kids that they don't have phones, they don't have social media. So, but for me, I'm aware of how much am I just engaging on my phone, just in general, and, because how much are they observing me? And, I think that has a big impact on me personally in my parenting. And then I also find that kind of at night, when I'm spending more time on social media, I find that it impacts my mood. And so I'm curious to know, do you know, or what does the research say about that, just in terms of maybe outside of the teens, but adulthood and social media and moods?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, so the research would say that I think that it really depends on, again, like what people are doing on social media, and then who they are. So I think there are some people where they can, engage with social media in certain ways, and it doesn't really have much effect on them. They feel fine. On balance, it doesn't seem to make much difference. And then there are other people where it makes a big difference, and it can have either a big positive effect on their mood or a pretty big negative effect, depending on what they're doing. And I imagine for most of us, it's probably some combination of those things. So just depending on, what the time of day that we're using it, depending on how we're feeling beforehand, what we see when we go online. I think that can really affect how we feel afterwards. And I think that the important thing, I think, for anyone, teens or adults, is really trying to be mindful of that. So paying attention to when I use social media, or when I, log off, how am I feeling? And what is it that I'm doing that's making me feel better? And what is it that I'm doing that's maybe making me feel worse?
I think, like what you're talking about, it's so true of so many things, right? Thinking, with research and life, just in general, individual difference makes a huge impact, right? In any sort of finding that we see in research. But, right, And I think sometimes we forget about that. We speak in broad strokes, but often it's more about the individual.
Yeah, and I think that's such a a product of the way that research happens, is that so much of the time we're looking at averages. We're looking at kind of the average effect of one thing on another thing. But as research progresses, and I think it's now starting to in the world of social media, it's still pretty early, but as it progresses, we're seeing a little bit more nuance around individual differences and how does it affect certain people in what ways and when and that kind of thing.
So I'm curious, like thinking along those lines, when you work with adolescents, do you speak about this idea of, mindfulness around sort of social media use, or, how do you try to help them engage in a way that's healthy for them?
Yeah, so that's honestly my sort of number one thing that I talk to teens about is that mindfulness piece, is because so much of the time that we're using social media, it's mindless. That's kind of how it works, is that we pick up the phone and we're scrolling before we even realize that we're on social media. And so taking that second to just sort of pause and think about, why am I wanting to go on social media right now? What are my goals in doing this? What am I hoping to get out of it? And then when is it making me feel good and bad? Like, who am I when I talk to this person? How do I feel afterwards? When I post this kind of thing, how do I feel? When I find that I'm, scrolling sort of endlessly and passively, how is that making me feel? So I think with teens, it's similar to with adults, is just trying to take that second to think a little bit more about it. And it is particularly challenging for teens because we know that during that time, it's a little harder to sort of break those impulses to act right away. So I think it can be a really powerful thing when teens can take a few minutes to just pause and think more about it.
I agree. My teen had noticed something among her friends, and I'm just sort of curious as to whether you've seen this with adolescents and how this sort of fits into our conversation. I don't even know what all this means, to be perfectly honest. I have to admit, it makes me feel badly that I don't. But she's like, before everyone had their main Instagram page and everything was like very like curated, and then they would have like not fake Instagram, but then Instagram accounts only like a small amount of their friends had, and that was more like just them being goofy and doing their thing. And she was like, I feel like there's this like shift now where people are being more, genuine isn't the right word, but sort of more like goofy in themselves, even when it's like a larger audience. And she's like, that almost stresses me out more. You're sort of putting yourself out there more. I'm just curious as to whether you're finding that and where you think that might be coming from.
It's so interesting because I do hear that a lot. And I think that a lot of teens talk about this as sort of authenticity, or be like, like there's this really sort of fear of being seen as fake online. And I think that maybe the movement towards more of what appears to be more authentic or real is kind of a way to try to get away from that being seen as being fake. But I think the irony is that no matter what, it's all still being sort of curated for an audience. It's all, you're choosing what you're portraying about yourself. And so I do think that's true for a lot of teens, that it actually feels like more pressure because, now it's, you need to look good, you need to be saying and doing certain things, but you also need to have it look like it's real and like it's really you. So I think it in some ways creates even more pressure. It sounds like your teen is finding that.
I would agree. Like, it's like, as a girl, you have the makeup, it's not supposed to look like you have makeup on. And, there's just all this.
Yeah, definitely.
This is making me a little anxious, actually, because it's making me like, I'm very aware of my own social media use, but thinking about how I'm going to create this structure around appropriate social media usage. And I know you kind of mentioned some guideposts or some questions, but do you have any other suggestions, like in terms of maybe, for example, thinking about your own son and as he grows up to become a preteen, like when would you introduce a phone? Have you thought about how that should be introduced? Are you going to consider some kind of contract? So there's a lot of, boundaries in place. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of the question of specifically when to introduce a phone, I know this is a question that so many parents wonder about, and it's a tricky one because there isn't one, of course, right age. And unfortunately, the research can't tell us specifically when. I will say that the current, nationally representative estimates would say that about 70% of kids have a phone at age 12. So I know it's a common time to get a phone is usually in that transition between end of elementary school, beginning of middle school. But that doesn't mean that that's right for every family. And I think that when introducing the phone, I think it is important to have a lot of structure around it. So that might include, you might introduce a phone, but not yet introduce social media. And in fact, I would probably recommend that. I think that having kids get used to using the phone in different ways before they then take on this new challenge of trying to navigate social media, I think can be useful. I do think having a sense of what your rules and expectations will be before getting the phone and having the conversation, multiple conversations with your kid about that is critical. And some families do like to put it in writing. So with some kind of plan or something like that. I think the important thing is that you're engaging your kid in the process. So they're part of the conversation. They're very aware of what the rules are going to be. Maybe they're even contributing what they think would be reasonable limits or rules. And the other thing I'll say is that I think when you first introduce a phone is a really good time to sort of start with maybe something more restrictive or something just more having more rules in place. And then over time, as your kid shows that they can be responsible and they get older and they need more independence, then you can kind of loosen the reins.
I may be putting you on the spot here, so sorry. I'm like, as a mom of a teen. Okay. So yeah, I like this idea of thinking about restrictions, and we definitely went through all that. But then, so if you notice, like, what would your advice be if you notice your teen is maybe spending more time than you want, but within the boundaries of all the limits that you set, like whether, not that much time on TikTok, that much time on Instagram, but yet somehow they're still on their phone all the time. Mm-hmm. Do you have advice on how to then kind of put the reins tighter after you've already loosened some, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is also something that, obviously so many parents run into, and with lots of issues, not just with the phone use, but I think one thing is setting it up in advance as something that you'll revisit. So, these are our rules right now. This is what we're going to try out, and say, a couple weeks from now, a couple months from now, we're going to revisit this, see how it's going, and see what we need to change. But the other thing is, I think that you can always, even if you haven't said that, you can always still revisit. And my advice with that would be to start small. So and what I mean by that is to pick out if there's, a specific time of day where you feel like your kid is on their phone too much, or a specific, place in the house, maybe like you don't want them to be on their phone when they're in the kitchen talking or supposedly talking to you, things like that. So starting with something that's very clear and very specific to change, and then having a conversation around, can we try for the next week or two, let's say when you get home from school, before you start your homework, no phone use during that time, or something like that. Just setting a really specific parameter. And then, putting a plan in place. How are they going to do it? What might get in the way? What are the specific rules you're going to try to put in place around that? And then see how it goes. I think often, so kids may resist some of that, but they also might be open to it, especially if they're part of the conversation. And there are many kids who say that they want to spend less time actually on their phones, but they're having a little trouble, putting that into place. So having the support around it can actually be really helpful for some teens.
I also find, now as a mom of a teen, that it's like you really have to put your money where your mouth is. So,
Yes.
I'll tell her, but I'll be like worried about this grant review that's coming or whatever. And so I want to check my email. And she'll be like, well, that's not fair. I'm like, you're right, it's not. But sometimes it's hard to follow through on our end too, right?
Definitely. It's really hard. And I think that that's a really good opportunity for just showing empathy, showing that you get it and that it is hard to do these things. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's not you against your teen, it's sort of both of you against the technology. So both of you are working together to come up with strategies that will work for everyone, including both of you. So.
I love that. I'd love to hear where's your research going? Like, what are you currently working on? What are the big questions that are coming up? I'm sure the questions are endless, but what are you kind of focusing on right now?
Yeah, so there's a few different areas that I'm focusing on. So one strand of my work is focused on teens who are higher risk. So in particular, right now, I'm working with teens who are at risk for suicidal thoughts and behavior, and looking at, for those teens, how social media use can both be protective in terms of providing social support and resources, but also how it can be potentially harmful. And so that's one area that I'm working on right now. Another area is more generally, among all teens, thinking about what are kind of resiliency factors when teens are using social media. So what I mean by that is, what are some characteristics that teens can cultivate that may help them when they're using social media to do so in healthier ways? And so, we were talking about mindfulness before. That's one example of a factor that I think that for teens who are able to practice more mindfulness skills, that's a factor that may help those teens then learn to use social media and engage with it in ways that are better for them in the long run.
Definitely much needed. Do you have can you give us any other tidbits on what those other variables might be?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So I think mindfulness is one. Another one is emotion regulation skills. And so that's obviously a very broad category and applies to a lot of different things. But kids who are better able to label their emotions, manage their emotions generally, recognize that their emotions are not harmful, all these factors that go into emotion regulation, that's another what I would think to be protective factor in terms of social media use, because we know that social media, as we said, can impact mood in a lot of different ways. And so having the ability to recognize that and to then manage those emotions that come up, I think is really critical.
I love that, because I like to research emotion regulation in earlier childhood, but just thinking sort of how these factors that we support our children with when they're young, you wouldn't, I don't know, that's just not something I would have been thinking about this morning when I was writing about emotion regulation, right?
Definitely, yeah. These skills they develop when they're young can carry through into lots of different arenas, and technology use is certainly one of those, and an important one when it comes to preteens and teens.
Yes, without a doubt.
It's definitely a very pivotal skill, right? And the earlier that we as parents can be equipped to have those skills, then our children are better equipped at an earlier age, and we can continue to flourish and help build that in them. So I love that we're talking about that. We're talking about, this emotional literacy and emotional intelligence.
And I think how it relates to technology use, I feel like often we sort of think of these things almost like as separate in a way, and they definitely go together, right? I feel like there also needs to be more conversations among researchers, right? The kind of across these different fields to really support. We always talk about the whole child, but I feel like sometimes that kind of falls off the radar when you're, focused on your own research sometimes. And
definitely, yeah. And I think, the area of technology use and, child development. I think that's particularly one of those areas where there's so many different fields and areas where people are researching this. So, it's everything from, computer science researchers through to, psychologists. So it does take a lot of, I think, kind of interdisciplinary conversation.
Yeah. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us today. We loved having this conversation with you. And I know our listeners are going to want to hear where they can find out more about you. And please share with us your newsletter, because I am on your newsletter and I think it's fantastic. So please tell us about that as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And so listeners can find me. The easiest place is probably just my website, which is, jacquelineneesey.com. And then, as you said, my newsletter is also a good place to find me. It's called Techno Sapiens, and it is a newsletter on Substack. They can sign up for it through my website. And then I'm also on Twitter and Instagram by Jacqueline Neesey.
Thank you so much. This was so helpful. As a parent of a teen, I definitely took note.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.